the grandmother despised, who inherited the land and the justice of heaven. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porches of Riverside Heights, a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, where old brick houses stood like tired sentinels against time. The air carried the scent of brewing coffee and distant traffic, but in the cramped back room of 1247 Maple Street, 73-year-old Dorothy May sat on the edge of her narrow cot, slowly wrapping strips of cloth around her swollen ankles. Her arthritic fingers moved with practiced precision each motion, a small battle against pain that had become her constant companion. The room had no windows. Light seeped through the crack beneath the door, illuminating dust motes that danced like forgotten prayers. Dorothy's few possessions fit into a single wooden chest, a faded photograph of her late husband Harold, a worn Bible, and a small box containing her most precious memories. She had lived here for 3 years now, ever since Harold passed surviving. On the reluctant charity of her son Robert and his wife Sandra, they reminded her daily that she was a burden, their voices carrying through the thin walls like daggers wrapped in obligation. The sound of dishes clattering violently in the kitchen announced Sandra's morning routine. Dorothy winced, knowing the symphony of anger that would soon follow. Sure enough, Sandra's voice cut through the house like a rusty blade. She doesn't do anything but sit in that room and mumble prayers. Completely useless. Can't even help with the simplest chores anymore. Robert's mumbled response was lost in the clatter, but Dorothy had heard this conversation countless times. She pulled her threadbare sweater tighter around her shoulders and whispered a prayer for patience. Every day brought fresh humiliations. Dorothy swept the small courtyard behind the house, her bent frame moving slowly between the scattered toys and discarded beer cans. She fed the chickens with leftover scraps, her gentle voice cooing to the birds who seemed to be her only friends. When she tried to help with cooking, Sandra would snatch the spoon from her hands, declaring that Dorothy moved too slowly and made too much mess. When she offered to fold laundry, she was told her eyesight was too poor to do it properly. The message was clear: she was unwanted, unloved, and in the way. Her grandson Tommy, now 16 and full of teenage cruelty, had taken to hiding her reading glasses and moving her chair when she wasn't looking. Last week, she had found her cherished rosary in the garbage can, its beads scattered like broken promises. When she asked about it, Tommy had shrugged with practiced indifference. "It must have fallen. Not my problem, Grandma." The word grandma dripped with disdain from his lips, as if acknowledging their relationship was a burden he reluctantly carried. The breaking point came on a humid Sunday in late August. Sandra had invited the neighbors over for a backyard barbecue, and the small yard buzzed with conversation and laughter. Dorothy remained in her room, as usual, listening to the sounds of life happening without her, until Sandra burst through her door without knocking. "Don't just sit there like a lump." She snapped, her face flushed with heat and irritation. "Go pick some tomatoes from the garden, and make sure you get the good ones, not like last time." Dorothy nodded silently and made her way to the small vegetable patch Harold had planted years ago. Her knees protested with each step, but she carefully selected the ripest tomatoes, filling a small wicker basket with the red fruits that seemed to glow like small suns in her weathered hands. When she returned, balancing the basket carefully, the conversation on the patio stopped abruptly. Sandra snatched the basket from her hands and examined its contents with theatrical disgust. "This is all you could manage. Look at these." Sandra held up a tomato with a small blemish. "Half of them are barely ripe, and the other half are damaged. Can't even pick vegetables properly anymore." With deliberate cruelty, she turned the basket upside down, sending the tomatoes rolling across the concrete patio. "Maybe it's time we looked into that assisted living place downtown, somewhere with people who actually know how to take care of someone like her." The guests watched in uncomfortable silence as Dorothy knelt slowly to gather the scattered tomatoes. Her hands shook, not from age, but from the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. Robert sat frozen in his lawn chair, his eyes fixed on his beer bottle, unable or unwilling to defend his mother. The neighbors looked away, embarrassed to witness such cruelty, but unwilling to intervene. Dorothy collected each tomato with quiet dignity, her lips moving in silent prayer, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But what happened next would change everything. As Dorothy reached for the last tomato, something deep within her chest began to stir, not anger, but a quiet recognition that her time of silence was coming to an end. That night alone in her windowless room, Dorothy opened the wooden chest Harold had left her. Inside, beneath the photograph and the Bible, was a manila envelope she had never thought to examine closely. With trembling fingers, she withdrew its contents. A letter in Harold's careful handwriting, and beneath it a folded document with official seals and signatures. The deed to 1247 Maple Street, purchased in 1967 with Harold's factory savings, registered in both their names. After Harold's death, the property had passed entirely to her. Dorothy May Collins was not a charity case living on her son's generosity. She was the legal owner of the house where she was treated like an unwanted guest. Dorothy's tears fell onto the document as she read Harold's letter. "My dearest Dorothy, if you're reading this, I'm gone but not forgotten. This house is yours, as is the land it sits on. You gave me 50 years of love and loyalty. I want you to have security and peace. Use this knowledge wisely, my love. You're stronger than you know." The signature at the bottom was notarized and dated just months before Harold's death. She had been sitting on the deed to her own liberation for 3 years, unaware that her husband had provided her with more than memories. He had given her the power to demand respect. The next morning, Dorothy walked the 12 blocks to the Cook County Recorder's office. The young clerk, Maria Santos, remembered Dorothy from the church bake sales, where she had always bought extra cookies for the office staff. "Mrs. Collins, how? Nice to see you. How can I help you today?" Dorothy explained her situation with quiet dignity, showing Maria the deed and asking for confirmation of its validity. Maria's face grew serious as she examined the document, then brightened with a smile. "Mrs. Collins, this is absolutely legitimate. You are the sole owner of that property. Would you like me to make certified copies for your records?" Armed with the truth and official documentation, Dorothy returned home but said nothing. She spent the evening in prayer, not for revenge, but for wisdom. She had been given a gift, not just the house, but the opportunity to teach her family about respect, dignity, and the consequences of cruelty. The next Sunday, as Sandra prepared for another neighborhood gathering, Dorothy made her decision. She would no longer be silent. As the guests assembled on the patio, enjoying Sandra's hospitality and Robert's grilled burgers, Dorothy emerged from her room carrying a manila folder pressed against her chest. Her steps were measured, her spine straighter than it had been in months. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The conversation stopped abruptly, some guests chuckling at the unexpected interruption. From the family's elderly burden, Dorothy opened the folder and held up the deed, its official seals catching the afternoon sunlight. "This house we're standing in," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "belongs to me. It always has. Harold left it to me when he passed, and I have the legal documents to prove it." She turned to face Sandra directly, her eyes now blazing with quiet fire. "You've called me useless, a burden, someone who doesn't belong here. But the truth is, you've been living in my house, eating food bought with my social security checks, and treating the legal owner of this property like an unwanted guest." The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra's face went from flushed to pale her mouth, opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Robert dropped his beer bottle, the glass shattering on the concrete, his eyes wide with shock and growing shame. The neighbors looked between Dorothy and her family, suddenly understanding the dynamic they had witnessed for years. Tommy, the grandson, who had tormented her, stood frozen by the garden gate, his teenage bravado evaporating in the face of his grandmother's quiet strength. Maria Santos, who had arrived as Dorothy's invited witness, stepped forward with a warm smile. "I'm from the county recorder's office, and I can confirm that Mrs. Dorothy Collins is indeed the legal owner of this property. The deed is valid, properly notarized, and binding." She handed Sandra a certified copy of the documents. "Mrs. Collins asked me to bring these official copies so there would be no confusion about the legal status of this property." The transformation was immediate and profound. Neighbors who had ignored Dorothy's suffering for years now looked at her with new eyes, some with respect, others with shame for their complicity in her mistreatment. Mrs. Patterson from next door stepped forward first. "Dorothy, I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have spoken up when we saw how you were being treated." One by one, other neighbors approached, offering their regrets and their newfound respect. But Dorothy's greatest victory was yet to come. That evening, as the last guests departed and the family sat in awkward silence around the kitchen table, she made her intentions clear. "I won't be throwing anyone out," she said gently, "but things are going to change. This is my home, and I expect to be treated with the respect due to the woman who owns it." She looked at each family member in turn. "Robert, you're my son, and I love you, but your silence when I was being humiliated was almost as painful as the humiliation itself. Sandra, your cruelty ends now. And Tommy," she turned to her grandson, "you have a choice. You can continue being the angry young man who torments his grandmother, or you can learn what it means to be part of a family that actually cares for each other." The weeks that followed brought remarkable changes to 1247 Maple Street. Dorothy moved from the windowless back room to the master bedroom, where morning light streamed through lace curtains, and she could tend to a small garden visible from her window. She began cooking again, filling the house with the aromas of her legendary pot roast and homemade bread. Neighbors started stopping by for coffee and conversation, drawn by the warmth that had returned to a house that had been cold for too long. Sandra, initially resentful and sullen, gradually began to understand the magnitude of her cruelty. The turning point came when she found Dorothy quietly mending one of Sandra's torn work blouses without being asked. "Why?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything I did to you, why would you help me?" Dorothy looked up from her sewing, her eyes kind but firm. "Because that's what family does, Sandra. We take care of each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Robert struggled with his own guilt, knowing that his silence had enabled his wife's cruelty. He began spending evenings with his mother, listening to her stories about Harold and learning things about his father he had never known. "I was so focused on keeping peace in my marriage," he admitted one night, "that I forgot my duty to keep peace with my conscience. I'm sorry, Mom. I should have protected you." Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You can't change the past, son, but you can choose how to move forward. That's all any of us can do." The most dramatic change came from Tommy. The angry teenager who had hidden his grandmother's glasses and broken her rosary began spending time with Dorothy in the evenings, initially out of guilt, but gradually out of genuine interest. She taught him to play chess using a set Harold had carved by hand, and shared stories about his grandfather that revealed a family history rich with struggle and triumph. "Grandma," he said one evening after losing his 5th consecutive chess game, "I was really mean to you. I don't know why I did those things." Dorothy studied his face, seeing not the cruel teenager but the frightened young man beneath. "Sometimes we hurt people because we're hurting inside, Tommy. The important thing is learning to stop. Have you ever experienced or know someone who has experienced similar treatment from family members? Share your thoughts in the comments below." Dorothy's transformation of her household became a catalyst for broader change in the neighborhood. She began hosting weekly coffee mornings for elderly residents, many of whom had been isolated and forgotten by their own families. Her living room became a haven where people could share their stories, their struggles, and their wisdom. Mrs. Patterson brought her famous apple turnovers. Mr. Rodriguez shared tales of his years as a factory worker, and slowly the neighborhood began to remember the value of its older residents. Word of Dorothy's story spread beyond Riverside Heights. The local newspaper ran a feature article titled "The Grandmother of Justice," and suddenly Dorothy found herself receiving letters from elderly people across Chicago who had experienced similar treatment from their families. She responded to each letter personally, offering encouragement and practical advice about legal rights and community resources. "Age doesn't make us invisible," she would write. "It makes us experienced. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't matter." The ripple effects continued to expand. Sandra, deeply affected by Dorothy's grace in the face of her cruelty, began volunteering at a local senior center, helping elderly residents navigate legal and medical issues. She discovered a passion for advocacy work and eventually became a certified elder rights counselor. "Dorothy showed me that strength isn't about having power over others," Sandra explained to a group of volunteers. "It's about using whatever power you have to lift people up instead of tearing them down." Robert used his skills as a carpenter to begin offering free home repairs for elderly neighbors, understanding that small acts of service could have profound impacts on people's quality of life. He and Dorothy worked together on these projects, their relationship healing through shared purpose and mutual respect. Tommy, inspired by his grandmother's resilience, began a community service project at his high school, organizing teenagers to help elderly residents with yard work and grocery shopping. The final test of Dorothy's new family dynamic came during the Christmas season. Sandra suggested they host a large family gathering, inviting relatives who hadn't visited in years. "Are you sure you want to take this on?" Robert asked his mother, knowing how much work it would involve. Dorothy smiled, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. This house was meant to be filled with family and laughter. It's time to remember what that feels like. The Christmas Eve gathering was a triumph of love over resentment. The house glowed with warmth, and light filled with the voices of 3 generations, sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of memories that bind families together across time. Dorothy, resplendent in a red dress that Sandra had helped her choose, moved through her guests with quiet pride, no longer the forgotten grandmother relegated to a back room, but the matriarch whose wisdom and strength had restored her family's foundation. As the evening wound down and the last relatives departed, Tommy approached his grandmother with a small wrapped package. "I made this for you," he said shyly, his adolescent bravado completely absent. Inside was a hand-carved chess piece, a queen polished to a warm glow and inscribed with the words, "Grandma Dorothy, the queen of our family." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her grandson, feeling the circle of healing complete itself. In that simple gesture of love and respect, that night, as Dorothy sat in her comfortable bedroom, looking out at the snow-covered garden, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from despair to dignity. The deed to the house had been important, but it was not the paper that had transformed her life. It was her decision to claim her worth, to demand respect, and to respond to cruelty with strength rather than bitterness. She had learned that justice sometimes comes not through revenge, but through the patient work of teaching others how to love. In the months that followed, Dorothy's influence continued to spread throughout Chicago's South Side. She was invited to speak at senior centers and community organizations, sharing her story and encouraging others to advocate for themselves and their families. "Don't wait for someone else to recognize your value," she would tell audiences, her voice strong despite her 74 years. "You have to be willing to speak your own worth into existence even when the world tries to convince you otherwise." Dorothy Mae Collins had begun that terrible Sunday morning as a forgotten woman in a windowless room, but she ended as a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt invisible, unwanted, or powerless. She proved that dignity cannot be taken away. It can only be surrendered, and even then it can always be reclaimed. Her house on Maple Street became a symbol of transformation, where cruelty was transformed into kindness, silence into strength, and a family's shame into a community's inspiration. The story of the grandmother of justice spread far beyond the borders of Chicago, carried by letters, phone calls, and the simple power of people sharing hope with one another. Dorothy had inherited more than a house. She had inherited the opportunity to show the world that respect for the elderly is not just about being kind to the vulnerable, but about recognizing the strength, wisdom, and dignity that comes with having survived long enough to become a guardian of family history and community memory. As Dorothy often said in her later years, heaven doesn't forget the forgotten. Sometimes it just takes a while for the rest of us to remember what we've been missing. Her legacy lived on in every family that learned to cherish its elders, every community that created spaces for intergenerational connection, and every person who chose to respond to cruelty with grace and to injustice with quiet, persistent strength. Congratulations, Type 7, in the comments, so I know you stayed with me until the end. Leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. See you